All right, everyone, welcome back to Getting in a College Coach Conversation. We just had a really great discussion in the first segment with my colleague Vanessa around students with disabilities and how they can research the college application process and find a best fit college as they consider what their right higher education path is going to be. And now we have I said student in the former segment, but actually a recent graduate of Brandeis University joining us, Sasha Manus. Hi, Sasha. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Delighted to have you and really excited to talk a little bit about your story. And I would love to start if you could put yourself way back in the shoes of your high school self when you were applying to college. Just a little bit about what were primary considerations for you as someone with CP when you were looking for the right fit college for you?
So this is going to sound a little off the wall here, but my high school and my primary school before that, neither of them were ADA accommodated. Neither were ADA compliant. My high school didn't have an elevator. My primary school had an elevator, didn't let me use it. So I threw my backpack in it. So I went into college expecting hostility just because that is what I experienced prior. I was the first student with a disability at my high school, the first one in my primary school, which is horrific considering when the ADA was passed. Right. But I was more looking for programs that fit my intellectual style. At the time, I was a playwright. I had my off-Broadway premiere when I was 16 years old. It was a show at the Lucille Lortel called Shooting the Sparrow, and it was done through Young Playwrights, Inc. Unfortunately, this organization no longer exists, but it's a wonderful organization. And I chose to go somewhere I knew where culturally and socially I would be relatively safe in comparison to a lot of other places. I didn't consider accommodations because I knew no matter where I went, students with disabilities were not expected to be there. That was the message I got everywhere. That was the message I got from my schools. So I knew it was going to be a challenge no matter where I went.
Now, when you got to Brandeis and you started your education there, what did you begin to do with respect to accommodations? How did you start to ask questions about what you were entitled to because of the ADA, because of supports that Brandeis was needed to offer you?
I lived in quote unquote accessible housing that was blocked by a dumpster, and the wheelchair accessible door didn't actually work. Okay. So I was very lucky. Yeah. I was very lucky that my school, being a Jewish high school, focused a lot on law and law interpretation. So before I went to Brandeis, I studied the ADA. So I learned what I was entitled to. And because I was an early decision student, I had emailed them 6 months before I arrived saying, "Hi, my name is Sasha Manus. I'm a student with grade 2 spastic diplegic cerebral palsy. I have fine and gross motor impairments, and I have these accommodations from my high school." And then when I actually got there and I started pointing out some of the issues I was having, like someone in the science department saying that I shouldn't be there because of my disability. And there's a wonderful woman in her place. Her name is Kara Street. And she knows the ADA. She knows what's required. And it's totally transformed access to campus for students with disabilities now. But I would say my first 2 years at Brandeis, I debated leaving every single year because I couldn't complete my core major requirements on campus. I received horrific hostility from professors specifically about my accommodations. I have a guide dog because I have a cortical visual impairment, otherwise known as a CVI, which about 90% of people with cerebral palsy have, which basically means that my visual processing is impaired, but my acuity is perfect. So that can be very confusing for someone trying to provide accommodations. Yeah. Because I don't need the typical accommodations of a blind student, but I still need some of them. And that can be very hard to justify to a professor who doesn't fully understand the neurologic impact of something like a hypoxic brain injury, or in my case, periventricular leukemia.
When you're in these situations where there's a lot of complexity to these different kind of conditions, they're obviously very impactful conditions that you have to wrestle with every single day. To what extent are you explaining this over and over again to people around you so that they can understand, versus kind of saying, all right, I can cope and, go to class and do what I need to do. You seem to be very determined in many respects, but I'm just curious about how much you have these conversations with folks in terms of.
I ended up having these conversations on a nearly daily basis. In my junior year, I ended up serving on the student union as a director of advocacy and accessibility for about 6 months. I withdrew from that position in part because I went on medical leave, but in part because I realized a lot of it was legal issues that I did not have the training to deal with because I'm not a lawyer. I may know the ADA like the back of my hand, but that doesn't mean I can interpret it. And so I had these conversations daily. I spoke to professors, and I've had a wonderful few professors. The ones that stick out, of course, are the most negative experiences because that's how trauma works. But I can think of my advisors, Dr. Woodruff, Dr. Piasta. These are all people in the biology department, Dr. Myra. I would sit down with them and I would talk to them about my disability and about what the purpose of accommodations were. I remember being a freshman and having a conversation with Dr. Piasta, who ran something called the Galaxy Project, which is to support students from underrepresented backgrounds in science. And students with disabilities are very underrepresented in science. We make about 6% of the graduate student population. And the number of students with physical disabilities, there's not even data on that.
So there are, and what I love is that there are these examples of people who are connecting with you, who are advocates for you, who are there to support you. Of course, unfortunately, there are going to be those that stick out in many respects. I'm curious about advice that you would give for students as they are considering the college that they may go to. You said that accommodations were not front of mind for you. Intellectually was, that's what you were looking for. That was your primary and driving factor when you were considering school. I think safety obviously was a very important one as well, right? But what kind of advice would you give for students as they are considering the community that they're going to be a part of? How can they predict, if it's even possible, what life will be like on campus when they get there?
So something I attended UC Berkeley for a year when I was on medical leave, and UC Berkeley is one of the most accessible campuses in the country. And it's really hard to predict the culture of accessibility on a campus. Both campuses were entirely inaccessible, but Berkeley has a very positive attitude and history towards disability accommodations. And Brandeis is a very negative one. And this is now starting to change. But I'm the first student with a physical disability to graduate with a biology degree from my department.
Ever.
First one. They wanted me to speak at commencement. So that weighs very heavily on me. But what I would say is, if you're a student trying to predict where you're going to end up, is what field you want to go into. I didn't know I wanted to go into STEM when I first got to college. I was a playwright.
Classic story. Yeah.
I fell in love with diseases as a little kid. My area of interest research-wise has always been, really since the age of 12, genetic, neurodegenerative, pediatric onset diseases like Tay-Sachs and Sanfilippo syndrome. And I took a genetics course and I fell in love and quickly changed from being humanities to being STEM, not realizing what I would face. And I would say humanities tends to be more accommodating. So if you're planning on going into the arts or into the languages, you will have less issues than if you're going into the sciences. And that's simply because of that's simply because of pedagogy.
Right. The lab expectations, the physical requirements within the lab, how they're kind of situated makes it more difficult for someone with a physical disability to get around and do that kind of work. Whereas for humanities, I was a humanities major. We just sit around a table and talk about what our ideas are. That, you just have to get into the room, essentially.
Right, exactly. And once you get into the room, you're fine. One of my experiences is I was a Judaic Studies minor. My minor GPA was a 3.89. My overall GPA was a 3.4, 3.399, 3.4. So that should really tell you the scale of the challenges that I had. I've broken out my GPA, removing the labs. I would have a 3.7 and my STEM GPA is a 3.1. And that's because of being unable to have meaningful participation in the labs. And frankly, it got to the point where I would show up, but I would be completely apathetic because I couldn't participate.
Right.
So if you're interested in the humanities, first of all, Brandeis is incredible. They've got the humanities is phenomenal there.
Yeah.
And that was one of the reasons I went. But what I have found is that the humanities tends to be more progressive in their mindset about accessibility, because they don't see as accessibility as impinging on their pedagogy as much as in STEM, which is still very much fine motor focused.
Yeah.
If you are a student with a disability who wants to go into STEM, I have two recommendations. One, go to a public university. They are more likely to be up to ADA standards, even though they will not be completely up to ADA compliance. Or two, expect to take another year and do all your labs off campus. And that's simply because private colleges never expected to admit disabled students, especially not elite colleges. One of the jobs I had at Brandeis, I was hired to look for any buildings that were ADA compliant on campus, and I found none. No building was fully compliant in any department. And some of these buildings are from 2014. So that's clearly an architectural fault. I don't necessarily think that's the university's fault.
Yeah.
But a lot of elite colleges think the ADA is a joke because they never expect to have a student body with disabilities. I don't know if that answers your question. But it's being careful.
I don't know either, but I think that there's a lot of helpful storytelling that's involved here. And I think, the particular needs that you have are different from someone else's particular needs. And I think that's one of the challenges, right? Is like how you identify what you're going to need. ADA compliance seems to be like a minimum barrier that one would jump over. And I actually remember about a couple of years ago, I was at a program for Reed where I went to school, and the dean of the faculty, who was also a physics professor, was walking us through a mental exercise. There was a group of people in a room, and she said, I want you to imagine that you're walking into Volume Lecture Hall, which is the biggest lecture hall on campus. And you walk in and you're going to go find a seat, and you want to be in a position to take good notes so you can see the front of the room. Imagine yourself doing that. So we did. And then she said, now I want you to imagine you're in a wheelchair. How are you going to get into your seat? How do you arrive at the front of the building? What path do you have to navigate to get there? Where do you have to wait for somebody to open a door for you? Is there a button that you can push to open the door? All of these things, I think that like something as simple as I got to get into the lecture hall, which by the way, all freshmen have to do 3 times a week, is for the majority of the student population very easy. And I think that what you are pointing to is something that's an everyday part of your life. I have to figure out how to get to these labs. I have to figure out how to do these labs. I need the accommodations to do that. And is not necessarily front of mind for people who don't have that same everyday consistent occurrence that you have. I want to know from you, because you graduated with a science degree, the first one in your department ever with a physical disability. You persisted despite the fact that, a 3.1 is still a good GPA, especially at Brandeis. Let's just say that first of all, but like, it's not your greatest strength relative to your minor strength, or the minor that you did. What drives you? What pushed you? Where is this source of motivation? Because you seem very driven. You seem very motivated. Where does that come from?
It's really internal passion. I am fascinated with disease. And again, if I were to break my biology grades out from my lab grades, I'd have a 3.7, which is very impressive for STEM. The reason my GPA is so low is because of organic chemistry, which whole other story. The reasonable accommodation would have been me not taking that class because I am stereo blind. So I couldn't access the material. But I think what drives me is passion and a real hunger for knowledge and a real hunger to grasp onto information and to challenge it. And something very unique about Brandeis is that in most classes, you're not expected to sit silently and just listen in the lecture hall. You're allowed to get up there and challenge your professors. And that's such a profound experience that you're treated like a colleague, really, even when you're still an undergraduate. And that it's just that drive to keep challenging and keep learning. And that's why I stayed at Brandeis. It's really that internal fire, that love of disease, that love of knowledge that's what got me through it.
It's interesting to hear you, because I think at the start of the interview is sort of like, here are all the things that kind of went wrong for me in my college experience at the beginning. And then somewhere in the middle, you were like, I love Brandeis. It's a great place. You said I fell in love with genetics, which is, by the way, like a very weird, and most people don't say that. Like, it's a very uncommon kind of thing, but like, I'm here for it. I love to nerd out too. But it shows these complex feelings, I think, that people can have about their college experience. And the complexity for you, I think, is rooted in actual literal obstacles to your ability to learn. But I think it's also important for every student to be aware of the fact that you will have complex feelings about where you go to school. There will be professors you love and professors that drive you up the wall. You will have classes that are wonderful and rewarding and stimulating, and classes that you find to be unstimulating. And I think part of coming to grips with a college experience is understanding that it's not always perfect, and finding the kind of motivation that you found with, I love this particular thing. I cannot imagine not thinking about diseases. It is so fascinating for me. That's challenging for students to identify, but that's really what we're looking for in that experience. What is next for you? You've just finished in December, first one ever from your department. What is next? What have you got your eyes set on?
I plan on pursuing a PhD in computational biology and computational genomics.
So easy stuff, really.
Using computer modeling to predict predict pathogenicity of genetic variants, which is how the genetic changes in our code affect how diseases affect the human body. There's specifically, my area of interest is the pediatric leukodystrophies, like Alexander's disease and Aicardi-Goutieres syndrome. And there are some individuals with these diseases who have the classic fast neurodegenerative decline and die in childhood. There are other individuals that have the same pathogenic mutation and have incredibly mild symptoms. And we can't explain why, because it's an incredibly small part of that patient population. But if what I want to do is to look at their entire genetic code and see what is the modulating factor, what is the mechanism that is going on that allows this horrific disease to present so mildly, and then how can we replicate that pharmacologically in order to more effectively treat these diseases. Most diseases won't have cures, and I know that's heartbreaking to say. No one's ever going to cure cancer, but we can treat it. It's about giving people quality of life, and I think a part of my desire to do that comes from really suffering horribly during my childhood. I had really poor medical care growing up. I developed gastroparesis at 12. I was undiagnosed until I was 19 when I came to Boston Children's through Brandeis. I was 80 pounds when I got to college, eating less than 300 calories a day because my stomach was paralyzed. And people just thought that I was either looking for attention, or people thought I was bulimic or anorexic, or that I was just anxious. Someone accused me of having somatoform disorder. I don't have any of these things. But to be constantly starving as a young person, that affects you. So that's probably where my love of disease comes from, is being undiagnosed for so long.
Yeah.
But now being healthy and being well, my first couple years of college, I wasn't. I broke my neck my sophomore year in 2019, and I didn't go on medical leave because I didn't have medical care back home that would deal with it appropriately. Talk about layers on top of layers.
There's layers on top of layers. Yeah. And unfortunately we are out of time, but it's incredible stuff. And I think, March is Cerebral Palsy Awareness Month. 2 days after this airs is National CP Day. And so hopefully at least this conversation, for those who are listening, you can be aware of the different afflictions that those with CP have to manage every single day. And Sasha, I know you've been pushing a lot within your community for more awareness of ADA and how to support students with disabilities. And hopefully this session amplifies that conversation for you. So thank you very much for coming on the show today and telling that story.
Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful.
I think it was great. It was wonderful to talk to you. And it's always great to talk to somebody who is really passionate about what they want to study. So good luck to you. I hope we see your name in some very important published papers sometime in the future.
Thank you. If I could say one last thing to people looking at colleges,
Sure.
It's going to be difficult, but it's worth it. Just getting that desire to study what you love and to feel that euphoria and that excitement and that drive to get up every morning and to be in a community that supports what you love, even with all the ADA issues and the systemic discrimination, it will give you a motivation to live and to thrive, even when everything else is shutting you down. So it's worth it. It's going to be hard, but it's completely worth it.
All right. That's a great note to end on. Thanks a lot, Sasha. I love it.
Thank you.
Folks, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about some scholarships and financial aid that might be available for students with disabilities. So stick around.